Des Moines, how the hell are you? Yeah? So, yeah, come on, let's do it. So I'll just say it's an absolute privilege to be able to come here, and DevOps in general has been very kind to me, and some of that's probably my choices and some of it's my circumstances, and I feel the first DevOps Days was like 60 people, right? And now you have them all over the place, and the biggest one I know of is over 1,000 people, and to have 250 people come together in a small city in the middle of America, I think that's pretty awesome. And I also think it's against this larger backdrop, which we'll kind of come to, where the world's actually changed in the sense that if you have access to the internet, you can get a compiler, and now you're unstoppable, right? So a word from my sponsor. So I work for a company called Pivotal. I don't know if you know what an IPO is, but we're probably about to have one. Our mission is to transform how the world builds software. They pay all my expense reports. I love it. But I have a mission too, and this is sort of in line with basically the last decade of my career to transform how the world operates software. And I think if you see some of the stuff I've done, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand what that means to me. So I have an agenda. I've used this agenda before. Maybe, I don't know. If you've seen me talk before, you'll recognize it. It's not there to amuse you, it's there to amuse me. So back in the day, this thing's like scaring me. Anyway, so this is me, Andrew, and I did some stuff, and some of that stuff involves computers, and some of that stuff involves people. I was part of organizing the DevOps Days format. I wrote some books about web operations. I've been involved in Velocity, DevOps Days, Puppet, OpenStack, Cloud Foundry. I've also done lots of projects with Chef and dabbled with Ansible, and a bunch of my friends run Salt. And I don't really care about tools, but I also think tools are awesome, so this is where we are. But this is actually the most important slide, because this is my Twitter handle. And my logo. So you need to know what kind of narcissist you're dealing with, because I made myself my own logo. So there it is. And this is actually the easiest way to get a hold of me. Much more effective than email, and maybe on the same level as texting me. But I also come in various different configurations of beard and hair. So if you see me some other time, I might look different. These are all pictures of me in the last few years, so there you go. I think I'm about due for another head shaving. And again, just to amuse me, I've given talks about things that I thought were interesting, and for whatever reason, people thought that they were useful and helpful and insightful, and so they keep asking me to say stuff, so here we are. We're going to talk some more. So yeah, all that stuff's online. If you think anything I say today is interesting, there might be more stuff that I said before that's as interesting or more interesting. So here's some important DevOps stuff. I already kind of talked about one a little bit. I'm serious here. Learn how to read, learn how to write, learn how to speak, and follow me on Twitter. Those things, nothing will change the dynamic of your career in technology more than being able to communicate effectively. And for me, and I remember the first time I went to a conference, and I'd been working as a developer for a while, and I went to this, it was a Ruby conference, and I was just starting to kind of get involved with trying to make Puppet a real thing, and I was like, these are my people, Because I was working in this place, and there was all this toil, we'll call it. I'm going to come back to that word more than once today, but it wasn't fun. Like, I wasn't inspired, right? It felt like drudgery, and it felt bad, and I didn't always like the people I was working with, and I certainly didn't like the decisions that were being made for what they wanted me to work on. But then I met these people, and I was like, yeah, these are my people, right? And that moment changed the arc of my whole career, right? If I didn't understand or didn't get excited and attached to this dynamic of a global community of practice, which you can all participate in, like who right now has given a talk at a meetup? who's given presentations internally. So like that's communication, right? That's how you build these interesting communities and these interesting skills. And in the world that we live in with Slack, you can participate in a global community, right? And I'm going to come back to that theme. So here's my short TLDR for this talk and basically every talk, because I also feel pretty much everything that needed to be said about DevOps was said in 2008, and then we just kind of keep re-saying it and like reiterating and like kind of moving it along. But like there's certain principles that I feel like they don't really change, right? The tools change, and like some of the nuance of what you can do with the tools change. But the fact of the matter is, you align people or you don't, right? And you get people to work together or you don't. So the way to improve dev is dun dun dun, improve ops, right? And the way to improve ops is to improve dev. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, what it means. So I sent someone a message. I was like, what do you think people need to hear? And they're like, operations doesn't go away in the cloud / on-call kindness. So I thought about that, and we talked about it. It's like, okay, let's see where that goes. So this is what I got. This is what came out of that. I got more stuff too, but we're going to go through this a little bit. Also, I really don't like being talked to, and whenever you're in a room full of people who do work, I always kind of assume like they're smart people if they're in tech. So if anyone wants to interject or like say something interesting, like just shout at me. I'm into it. Some people don't like that, but I'm into it. Let's go. All right, so what is operations? Operations is the secret sauce, right? Just not the traditional operations. And I didn't say this. This is Jesse Robbins on the O'Reilly radar in a blog post from 2007. So has anyone ever seen this graphic before? Because I put it in, I don't know, probably a third of my talks since 2007. So this is sort of primordial DevOps, right? So DevOps isn't quite a word yet. Puppet's been released for 3 years. Chef's about to be released. Jesse Robbins is a founder of Chef that came from Amazon, writing on O'Reilly Radar about the difference in the startups that have a competitive advantage with how they treat operations. And so the way that you can frame this graph, or the way you should think about this graph, is that in this left side, that there's something that happens, and there's a lot more work that has to be going forward, from day 2, from that deployment forward, versus the right side. So there's a difference. Everyone can see one graph is higher than the other one, right? And that graph represents the amount of work that people do. And then there's this bottom, which is trying to capture the number of servers, which now, like to me, 20 servers seems ridiculously small, but whatever, we'll go with it. It was 2007. And so the idea here is that this number of machines is ramping. So the overarching message from this is that you can manage more machines with less effort if you have the sauce, right? If you have the operation sauce. And that has to do with, the golden age of DevOps and, Chef and Puppet and all this stuff is kind of being interesting. And now we live in a world where like that's all changed too, right? And I'm going to come back to this notion of crashing waves of innovation a few times. But you have a world that's changed even since 2007 now, right? Like what you can do with a container scheduler today to manage this kind of complexity at scale is frankly unfathomable from the time this was written, right? So you have even more opportunity to drive down this thing. So if operations is performing a fixed set of technical tasks, bye. It was fun while it lasted, right? And it doesn't mean that there won't be that task for someone to do, but I don't want to do it, and hopefully you don't want to do it either, honestly, because that's not where the future is. That's not where those competitive advantages are. if operations is the proper care and feeding of systems, and when I say systems right now, I'm not necessarily talking about one operating system. I'm talking about the complex, systems of microservices that people start to deploy now. Then let's go. It's going to be fun. So the tasks are going to change. But someone should make things work, right? Because I think that the burden, and I'm going to come back to burden a few times, in many organizations for making things work lands squarely on the face of ops, right? So it doesn't matter what there's also worth mentioning there's the transition that happens in the middle. So the story, I can go back and tell my story starting as a developer, late 90s, blah, 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 to now. But there's a transition that happens in the middle between, when the Agile Manifesto was written and sort of DevOps emerges, where in the old framing of software is actually shipped on a CD, right? It's a physical media. So you cut a release and it's gone. And people buy it in shrink-wrap boxes on shelves. Did anyone ever buy CDs, right? You did this, right? If you're old enough. Now we don't do this, but this actually happened. And at some point in the middle, software was no longer shipped on CDs, but it was running perpetually as a service. And that transition elevates operations to become a key part of the value chain of delivering that service. So if you're shipping CDs, then okay, it's done. The release is done. If you're operating a service, it's never done. It's never done, right? That's the rest of until you end of life the service and go out of business and shut off all the servers, right? It's never done. So someone better make it work. But what is happening is that operations is moving up the stack. So I have a few things to think about here, and I'll probably do this in an open space, but Simon Wardley has this notion of the commodification of things, right? So things start as a genesis, and we'll talk about Wardley maps in open space. I'd love to, because it's the best way to kind of prioritize strategy. So you start with this notion of an innovation, and then at some point it gets productized, and then at some point it becomes a utility. And what Simon argues is that this will happen. It's inevitable this will happen to everything, but you don't know when it will happen to specific things. And then that's where you kind of get your strategy from figuring out how to either take advantage of things that are commodified or trying to purposefully commodify things. So if you look at what's happened with cloud, lots of things that people used to have to do in physical data centers has now essentially been outsourced to some third party. Right? And it doesn't mean that people don't have data centers and they don't still do that stuff in some places, but there is some marginal value to doing that yourself versus what you could get from an API call that does the same thing, right? And this is a simplified representation, but there's some little bit of software that you make, and then there's a bunch of other stuff that has to exist, and that's all there, but it doesn't necessarily add value to what you're doing. Right? I want a kernel to exist, I want a database to exist, but I don't need to write a database, I don't need to write a kernel, I don't need to be that, someone better, hopefully, but Jess can do that, whatever, someone wants to do that. So all that is software, right, till the bottom, then it's not software, but most of that's software. And each one of those levels has some operational consideration. So if you look at the way that the world works, the question here is, which layer does my organization want to be responsible for? Right? So if you're on the bleeding edge of this right now, and it's all serverless or whatever, then maybe you don't have very much of that stack. And then maybe you have containers, or maybe you have VMs, or maybe you have whatever, and you're going to have more operational responsibilities. But you should make that decision deliberately and explicitly, understanding the trade-off for the value that you're creating versus the work that you're doing. So let's talk about work. So it doesn't make sense to talk about on-call until we talk about toil. Right? So the reason people don't like on-call is because it sucks. right? And why does this suck? Yeah. So the difference between these two graphs, the delta between the top graph, the left graph and the right graph, is what I'm going to call toil. So that's humans doing stuff. And for the most part, it's non-differentiating, repetitive work. That sucks. Right? No human likes doing that. At 2 o'clock in the morning, right? After your kid's game or whatever, yeah. So in the traditional world, there's not a lot of alignment for whatever reason. And I think part of it has to do that we manage things from the past. Like we have a bunch of, and this is like a separate rant, I probably don't have time to put in here, but most of what, I just don't have time, because I have a lot more slides, but most of what people are using for management principles are actually an artifact of the Industrial Revolution. And the type of work that has to be done to create good software and deliver that operational experience for everyone involved is inherently creative, and it's not really repetitive if you're doing it right? So you should take and get rid of all the repetitive stuff so you can focus on all this value-adding creative stuff, right? If you don't recognize that managing creatives is different than managing factories, then you're in trouble, right? But most people still have all that management baggage. And so they set up all these silos, and there's some reasons to have separations, but come on, like if the way that you communicate with developers and operations is passing tickets through a system where they're nameless and faceless, like you're inevitably going to hate each other. But you've also got incentives in the org with respect to their actual responsibilities and also, quite frankly, with their compensation, which put them against each other, right? So in a real sense, developers are incentivized to change stuff, right? That is what delivering features means. We're going to change things, right? And ops, every time you change things, you break things, right? So let's not change them. What do you think about that? So people have been having this debate, and they've had it in many forums, and it kind of gets recycled. So I've been saying since 2008, 2000, whatever, that devs should be on call. Like I say that all the time, right? And that's often me from the hip without context or nuance, like, put all your devs on call, right?
At 2 a.m.
Whatever, all the time, 24 hours, carry the pager for a week. That's what you should do. And I actually believe that, but it has to be framed. And there's some sort of backlash. And this was a thing that kind of stood out to me, especially when Jess sent me that text that happened on Twitter about a week ago. And I don't know TR. Maybe one day I'll meet him and we can buy sushi and talk about this topic. But I thought that the way he framed it, and it's a much longer thread, and you can go read it if you want, was interesting. So he's saying, okay, well, you're telling engineers to be on call, and it's not that I disagree, but sometimes that's expanding what a person's job is, right? So you've attached a certain set of parameters to what you think your job is, right? And I always think of, everyone's familiar with this notion of like code smells or like technical debt and that kind of stuff. I feel like that's cultural debt sometimes when people are like, that's not my job. Well, who's going to do it? Someone better do it, right? So that if we all, and you know this, you feel this every day in your job, I bet. If people just did, quote unquote, what their job was by strict definitions, there's all this stuff falling through the cracks everywhere, right? Like if you're in a real org that's really trying to do stuff and everyone's just doing their job, like it's not good. It doesn't actually work, right? Someone has to fill in all those things that weren't super well defined in the silos that were created. Okay, so what is this guy actually talking about? And he goes on, and I wanted to highlight a couple of the other points he made. So there's this bad version, because he gave a couple good versions, but we'll skip those. The person who set up Kubernetes quit, so we're going to put all the devs on call to make sure they can fix the cluster when it breaks, right? And so you took, also you're supposed to keep churning out features at the same rate, because you made those commitments on your sprint, right? Also, just for the record, and I said this more than once, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it again tomorrow, Scrum is a disease, Scrum is terrible, stop doing Scrum, like, it is garbage. Like, we can talk about that in open space too. So you're expected to work twice as much now, right? So it's not like, oh, here's this responsibility that you're going to get, and so we're going to take away this other bit of your workload. It's like, have some more, right? And I thought this was a great framing, and I love his language. And Jordan, or TR, or whatever your name is, because I don't really know you, but if we meet, I'll buy sushi. That the problem is not asking people to do more work that is important. The problem is asking them to do more work with no tools to make it easy, no guidance on priority, and with no conversation about why it's happening. Right? It's like, oh, here, do this thing. No context, like, but now it's yours. Here's the pager, have fun. Yay. But the opposite also happens, and I'm going to blame Scrum again here, but I've had many conversations, right? And a lot of times I'll end up in a conversation where someone, saw some DevOps thing or read some book about DevOps, and then they're like brought it to their org, and they're trying to do some stuff, and they explain to me what they're doing, and I'm like, wow, that sounds terrible. But I don't say that out loud usually. But I just think about it, because what happens in a lot of cases when people started saying, oh, we're going to do agile infrastructure, we're going to be DevOps, we're going to do all this stuff, it's like, well, you took all the old ops work you had to do, and you just add on all this new stuff, right? So it's like, okay, all the stuff you had to do yesterday, you got to do today, and now here's Puppet. Go have fun. Yeah, like, that doesn't actually work. And plus, there's a learning curve where you don't even know how to use these tools yet, right? Like, what are you doing to acquire skills to take advantage of those tools? If I just throw like GitHub at you, which I don't know if you've seen the internet before, but there's a lot of stuff on it, right? Like it's really, really overwhelming. So this is happening in ops on the same scale, right? Like, okay, here's more work. Also, now you have Scrum. Have fun with the commitments you made on your story points. Oh yeah, you were up till 4 a.m. keeping the site alive, but our 2-week sprints are due, so Scrum is a disease. Anyway. Yeah, I will. I should. I'll donate it to Black Girls Code or something. So this just makes me go like this. This isn't the only like DevOps conversation that makes me do this, but I definitely hate this when people have just increased the burden, right? Like you didn't decrease your burden, you increased your burden. And let's not do that. So the reason on-call sucks is because we're not good at software. We deploy stuff that's not really operable. And it's not, it breaks in weird ways, causes cascading failures in other places, and then you have no idea what's going on, and now you got to sort that out and fix it and put it back together on blood, sweat, and Red Bull or whatever, right? So putting the devs on call, the point of putting the devs on call, when I tell people to put devs on call, it's not just to make them suffer. I mean, that's cool. But it's not just for that. And I always as a dev, so I started as a developer, software developer in industry, and then I ended up being basically thrust into the domain of ops because I got involved with Puppet, and then I started getting, but even as a dev, even when I labeled myself and my title was developer, I always cared that stuff worked. It bothered me, personally bothered me when we deployed stuff and it broke for the customers, right? And I don't know, maybe all devs don't have that gene. I think it's provably true they don't, honestly, watching how some people make that. But the way to solve for this in a lot of organizations is, and this is not just about this particular topic, but everything comes back to feedback loops, right? So you want to make sure that the devs have some understanding of what operability means. And the best way to do that is wake them up at 2:30 with the choice that they made, right? It was their code that did that. And this is, I'll say, and I didn't put a bunch of stuff about cloud native in this presentation, but the way that every single Silicon Valley big web startup evolved, devs were always on call, right? So if you look at Google, if you look at Facebook, if you look at Amazon, and there's some really great quotes from Werner that I put in other presentations about if you're at Amazon, you build it, you run it, right? You are responsible for that. So that's the tight feedback loop. And Werner also wants, and makes it explicit, that you want the tight feedback loop for the devs to know their customers, right? So if you have these wide loops where devs don't get feedback on the features and the operability and the rest of this stuff, whatever the time cycle is, if it's not like this, like they're not going to make decisions like this. They're not going to make good decisions. It's going to take whatever that time cycle is, plus whatever they've committed to in the sprint, before they even get a chance to go back and revisit that. Where if you make it something that is painful, they'll change it. But the goal is not for ops to take burden or for devs to take burden. To me, the goal, and I'm going to start talking a little bit about something else I think is really interesting, and it's definitely worth adding to the way you think about this. The goal is to make the burden negligible, right? The goal is not to make someone else suffer. The goal is to use the suffering to reduce the suffering, right? Does anyone work out? Like, that's not always fun either, right? But it's nice to be in shape, right? And it's nice to be healthy. Does anyone always eat perfect food? Like, no. It's nice to eat dessert sometimes. But like, there's consequences, right? So let's make the good choices and do the right thing, even though sometimes we got to go through the hard things, right? So what is the point? What is the objective? And this is where I want to introduce some stuff. And has anyone read the SRE book? No? Does anyone know what the SRE book is? Yeah? Site Reliability Engineering is a free book, which I'm going to give you a URL for in a second, that you can read, which essentially explains how Google does their DevOps. And this is language that I'm borrowing from the SREs, and I encourage everyone to think long and hard about the way that they do some of these things, and particularly about these three things I'm going to assign to you. So this is homework. You probably didn't think you were going to get homework, but here you have some. This is going to take probably 30 minutes of your life to read 3 chapters. If you're a slow reader, it might take an hour. But the homework is to understand Google's framing without regard to any technical practices at all, these principles about embracing risk, which is essentially balancing that tension between stabilizing and destabilizing, between dev and ops, service level objectives, which is a way for, I'm going to explain it a little bit more in a minute, a way for them to basically make decisions and priorities about how they do work on stability versus features. And then this overriding goal to relentlessly eliminate toil. Any repetitive work, non-value adding repetitive work, should be eliminated, right? And then also as a bonus, if you want to do more homework, read the communication and collaboration, and that's right. So this is the site. You can go read it for free. They made it for free. If you like books, you could pay a little bit more and get one shipped to your house. Amazon will do that, or O'Reilly will do that anyway. This is very rich. It's like 500 pages. And there's a lot of stuff that's very specific to Google and might not translate to what you're doing. So I'd read it with an open mind, kind of understanding the principles and the context that you have mapped to those principles, rather than just say, oh, now we're going to do site reliability and not change anything at your org, which is what you did with DevOps, right? Like, let's be honest. So this is Google's definition of DevOps. So the way that Google uses service level objectives is it's essentially a contract between the software engineers, the SREs, which are essentially their ops, and the business. And everyone agrees to that service level, and then you measure stuff. So now you have a service level objective with a service level indicator, and if your air budget exceeds the level for that service, now you don't release features. If you are below your air budget, you can release at will. All right, and it's totally dispassionate, totally quantified. Our priority is to provide this service at this level. If we are providing this service at this level, we can add all the new features. If we're not providing this service at the level, which we've already agreed as with the business, then our priority is to make sure that we meet that service level, also by eliminating toil. And this isn't something the SREs use, but I started using it, which is they actually they don't use this framing, but they talk about if, in the SRE model that Google has, if a dev or SWE, software engineering team, is creating more toil for the SREs than 50%, then guess what? Now you're on call. So Google sort of graduated to this thing where they don't have developers on call for every service. It actually goes through a graduation. So when a service starts and it's small, developers are on call for it. When they prove that it's house trained, basically, that service can be trusted and has these service levels established for 6 months or so, then the SREs take it, and they'll be on call for it. But if you go back to being a bad puppy, then you have to sleep outside again, right? And then now you have the devs back on call. All right, so why are we here? I'm going to go really fast through the rest of this stuff because I only have 15 minutes and I put a lot of stuff. And some of it's gratuitous for me because I'm going to write a book about it, allegedly. So you're here for the DevOps, the opsing and the devings. Who wants the DevOps? Who wants it? Come on. We're going to come back to that. I got a little something for you. So this is me in 2010. I wrote a blog post about what DevOps means to Andrew. And I think it's held up pretty well. But basically, the idea is that people should work together. That's crazy, controversial, I know. And then and this is 2010, that system administration is evolving to look more like software development. Right? And that's only held more and more true. So in a world where you can write against an API to provision a machine, write against an API to configure a machine, write against an API to do all your monitoring, write against an API to do X, Y, and Z that used to be a task that someone did manually as an operator, that looks suspiciously like software development, and you can leverage a bunch of the things that we learned about software development and the tooling and Git and the rest of that stuff, right? If you don't have your system configs in Git right now, go home and do that like today, right? Like that is kind of a baseline to be able to even start doing any of this stuff. And then the third point I think is actually the most powerful, and it's the reason why I'll come to Des Moines and talk to you, is that we're all part of this. We're all solving this, right? We are more powerful, we are more capable, we are more intelligent together than we are in our little desk, on our little laptop, right? So the things that I can do individually are one thing, but because of this network of people that I've built through Velocity and DevOps that have seen all these other things, like I don't have to be an expert in everything because I can ask someone who is an expert. Right? And you should be able to leverage that too. There's no reason that you can't. There's nothing. The internet works here. I have proof because I used it. So I'm sure you could do this. And then there's this other framing that I really have liked. I've loved, and especially as it's evolved. But I feel like it's missing some detail. So has anyone ever seen this list of things, CAMs or CALMs? Yes? No? No one? Some people, they're nodding. So Damon and John have this podcast, DevOps Cafe, and you started using this a long time ago. I'm not exactly sure on the year, but I'm going to say like 2011, 2010 maybe. And I think it's a really nice framing, but it's like kind of inactionable, right? So you say like culture, automation, lean, metrics, and sharing. But what does that mean? Well, does anyone know what that is, by any chance? No? This is the 5 elements from Chinese medicine. And the thing that's interesting about the 5 elements from Chinese medicine and the way that they frame this in the systems of your body is that the elements have a constructive and destructive cycle. So some elements, and this has to do with like diet and exercise and a bunch of this stuff, but some elements like reinforce the other elements, and some elements sort of decrease, right? So it's like constructive and destructive interference. And I feel like these elements of DevOps have a similar kind of constructive and destructive cycle. And it's worth sort of thinking about how they reinforce each other in different ways, because you can automate too much relative to your metrics, relative to your monitoring, and maybe for your culture, right? And if your culture is holding you back, you're not going to do these other things too. So you have to kind of understand how these things reinforce each other to really optimize what you're trying to do. Systems thinking, right? So I'm going to just run through like what these sort of mean to me in the next 10 minutes, and then we'll close it out. and we'll go back to our thing. So culture, people say this all the time. It's actually usually used in kind of like a almost dismissive way to me. It's like totally inactionable. It's like, oh yeah, culture. What now, right? And there's some interesting framing, and like, okay, that guy's old and white, and he probably looked happy once, but not in that picture. So has anyone ever seen this, the Westrum topology of culture? So this is a very interesting thing, and this is actually in, it's referenced by a lot of people. This is in, I'm pretty sure it's in the Phoenix Project. I'm pretty sure it's in Lean Enterprise. Or I know, I'm almost positive it's in continuous delivery. Like people have been using this a lot in this sort of space, these conversations. But it's this idea that there's ways to think about your culture and ways to frame your culture that are more or less effective, right? And on a generative culture, people are focused on outcomes and they're cooperating. And in a pathological culture, you're killing the messenger, right? And I don't know where you live, but most people don't have generative cultures, right? I don't know how to fix that. Actually, I have a couple tricks, but we don't have time to go through them. That should be its own hour-long talk. But that idea of a culture, I want to take, that idea of a spectrum, I want to take and expand to the other 5 elements too, the other 4 elements. So in a generative culture, you have aligned incentives and interests. The one big thing that I see is sort of the flip that drives the culture that you need to be successful with the new wave of IT is reframing IT from a cost center to a competitive advantage, right? Like Google is not managing their tech as a cost center. Amazon is not managing their tech as a cost center. Go look at their earnings report. They're like dumping cash into infrastructure, right? And if you have a, God forbid, CTO reporting to a CFO, like that's just not going to happen. And that I see organizations that are set up like that. So if you are framing IT as a cost center, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like that's how you're going to live. So don't. Is anyone a CEO in here that could just go change that right now? Because sometimes, and I'm on the other side of this as much as I'm on the stage. It's like you hear a thing and it's like so obvious and like you wish you could fix it, but like you know you can't. Like not today, right? And not in the org you're in. So automation. I'm gonna give like a few slides that kind of frame how I think about automation. But I actually changed quite a bit from my early days of Puppet and like feeling the power of that kind of style of automation till now. And there's a few things. So one, there's like new tools, but I've actually come to believe that architecture actually makes as much or more of a difference as the automation. And that certain architectures are going to resist automation and recovery and like all these other things that you want for operability. So just taking whatever you have and trying to like automate it is going to lead to humiliation and disaster. Where you have opportunity to kind of rethink some of those architectures, you're going to have a better time. So automate all the things. I used to say that. I actually used to say that word for word. But then, so is that automation? Is it? I mean, that's like a thing, and you do a thing. That's actually not. That's some bash scripts in your home directory. This is automation. You make the robots run the bash scripts, right? And I already sort of said this, but I feel what, how, and why you automate is as important that you do, right? Why are we doing this? Why does it exist? The most powerful thing to understand is why. Whether you're in ops or devs, if you see something and you understand why, you can make the decision that it doesn't need to exist. Where if you only understand what, you're kind of doomed to make it do the same thing. So now we have these container schedulers, and we're like, let's take the robots and put them in the containers, and we'll just like put them all over, and it's going to be awesome. Whoops. This is the core lesson. It doesn't actually end as well as you'd hope. And I'm sure some of you have lived this, or you're about to. But this notion of a spectrum, on one side, I'm going to say you have kind of this thing that you just do by hand, like literally log in as root and type the command, right? Has anyone ever done that? Shh, don't tell him. I won't tell him. And then in the middle, you got some scripts and you got some stuff and it does some work and it helps you, but there's still a lot of toil. There's still a lot of people. And then if you see what's capable, what's actually happening, and you can get a lot of this basically off GitHub right now, you could get these platforms that are self-healing, and once you get them set up, because they are their own operational burden as well, then for a lot of the stuff that used to be toil, like just kind of goes away. Like lots of stuff around deployment and, God forbid you have things you need to restart. Like that's just gone, right? With the new type of stuff. And the other thing I think I'd like to point out here is this notion of, so in the old framing, everyone is worried about minimizing the incidents. You don't want incidents, right? We don't have an incident, so we don't want to go down. In the new sort of framing, as we transition till now, you get to this point where people are saying, all right, like what's the mean time to recover, right? And if we can drive down the mean time to recover, then our downtime goes down. So we're not so worried about failing. We know we can recover from failure, so we're good. And then in what I'll call like the highest evolution of cloud native, you have continuous partial failure. Right? You build systems where you know with certainty that things are failing right now, and that's fine. And they're going to be able to serve their service. The service level objective will not be compromised. It won't even affect the air budget. Right? You just know because you built it that way. And this is where the chaos monkey and the chaos engineering and all this kind of stuff comes in. So has anyone ever read the Borg paper? Does anyone know what the Borg paper is? So does anyone know what the Borg is? So I remember, and this is way back in the day when we were doing work with Google, if you said the word Borg in a room with Google employees, they would all stop talking to you, and like that was the end. Well, first they'd all look at each other, and then they'd stop talking. And if you got them alone and drunk, maybe you could get them to talk a little bit about it. But the Borg paper explains what the Borg does. It's the container scheduler that Google is built on. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, then it's fun to read. But I think this is the most important sentence. So this is a quote right from the paper. Almost every task run under Borg contains a built-in HTTP server that publishes information about the health of the task and thousands of performance metrics. And I will guarantee you that if you make everything that you have running publish its own health metrics, you'll get more benefit from that than you will from whatever fancy container scheduling solution you want to throw at the problem. That's what operability, that's what observability, being built into the software means. So metrics. I already talked a little bit about service level objectives. This is also straight from the SRE book. Google, in its own framing of reliability, its own conversations with itself, says that the basis, the foundation for reliability is monitoring. Service level objectives. What are your objectives? How do you know you're meeting them? And I'm going to have to go really fast to get through what I wanted to, because I'm almost out of time. So much faster. So these are a spectrum for the metrics. Sharing. We talked about this global community of practice, and we talked about this wall of confusion between dev and ops. And so the solution for a lot of people is say, well, let's put in a DevOps middle. And it's like, well, you just solved your silo problem with a new silo. So like, don't do that. Don't do that. What you actually want is building communities of practice, sharing up and down through the different layers. So this is like your dev, your ops, your security, testing. I always make security on the bottom, whatever. And this is, so to me, this is sort of another spectrum of everything is secret to the company, and we're actually participating in a global community of practice. Right? The things that you can learn and to accelerate your own organization from the global community right now, it will change the course of your career. It will change the course of your organization, but you as a person from Des Moines can participate in these global communities in a way that will change every opportunity from now forward. Lean is actually all these things. It talks about all these things. If you're actually deep into Lean, it talks about automation, talks about culture. But the thing that I think Lean adds that's missing is this notion of continuous improvement. And also, I think calm sounds better than CAMS. So this is the flow, and this is sort of like all of them is one spectrum. And this is me sticking needles in your enterprise to like try to get you to do the right thing. Doesn't always work. So everyone wants the DevOps. What they actually want, though, what they really want is scalability, availability, reliability, operability, usability, observability. They want it all for free without changing anything. Without changing anything. Like that's the key there. Let's not change anything. So this is this curve of early adopters. Who's ever seen this curve, like crossing the chasm and like early adopter thing? So this is a notion of a model for how innovation gets adopted across industries. And so there's this interesting phenomena which I think you see in DevOps and you see in Agile and you're definitely going to see in SRE and the rest of it, where people in the early adopter phase are actually seeking advantage. And then it transitioned to the majority, like once they see the advantages that they have, they're trying to get legitimacy because they were told that's the thing. And I see that a lot in DevOps now where people are like, oh, we're going to do DevOps or we're going to do Agile. And it's like, but why? Are you actually getting an advantage? You're not going to get an advantage because you're not actually motivated. And then to make it even more complicated, like this stuff is just like piling on top of itself, right? So there's innovation after innovation after innovation. And you sitting in Des Moines on the internet, like what things should you work on? What things should you bet on? How do you know? Like there's so many things, right? There's all these waves, right? Has anyone ever been surfing? No? It's hard. I tried to surf. I lived in LA for 2 years. It beat my ass, right? But software's hard. And software was always hard. And people talk about DevOps and they like put these people on pedestals, and I'm one of the people they put on pedestals. But this is what it felt like, right? This is a picture of me trying to manage OpenStack, right? Like, and this is a warning, right? So this is hard. And this is actually a true story from Texas where a man was told not to jump in, and he said, no, F that alligator, and then he died, right? And so what I'm trying to tell you is like, this is not easy, and you might die. So here's the 5 stages of DevOps, to kind of close it out. So you start with denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And that's how it is, right? So to me, this is actually my definition now of DevOps. So I used to write a blog post. This is what I have now. Optimizing human performance and experience operating software. That's DevOps. With software. So we're operating software with software and with humans. That's my DevOps. Software is hard. Humans is harder, right? So we got these opposing forces. Humans, terrible, awesome, right? Like, that's how it is. You are probably human. Humans can learn stuff. But learning is actually about change. You didn't learn anything until you changed your behavior. If you come here today and you see everything and you go home and you don't change your behavior, you didn't learn. You just collected trivia. You just collected information. I don't have time to learn new things because I'm too busy getting things done. The least productive person in the world. So saying DevOps doesn't fix your pathological culture, saying DevOps doesn't fill a lack of vision, saying DevOps doesn't align incentives and interests. Software is creative, software is complex, software is not digging ditches, software is not running factories, software is closer to art than science. These principles are more important than these practices, which are more important than these tools. The mindset you have is more important than the skill set you have, which is more important than the tool set. Adapting is more important than adopting. Why is greater than what? So here's the call to action, and then I'll get off the stage. Invest in yourself by investing in your community. So investing in your community means investing in your community at your organization, investing in your community in Des Moines, Iowa, and investing in the global community of practice of whatever you think you should invest in and whatever you're interested in. Don't attach your identity to your tasks. Don't define yourself by what you do. Don't define yourself by your titles. Do stuff. Don't just talk about stuff. Eliminate toil. Ruthlessly eliminate toil. Change your behavior. Change your behavior, change your behavior. These problems aren't technical, they're not people. The problem is actually both of them together. So you have to solve them both together. So Des Moines, be legit. I know you can. And being legit is not the same as seeking legitimacy, right? So thank you for your time. I'm not here to answer questions. I'm here to have conversations. Thank you.